She stood up, raised her glass, and said, "And this is Olivia, the fiend who wrecked our family." That was how my daughter-in-law introduced me at my grandson's 18th birthday dinner. I'm Olivia. I'm 72 years old, and that moment, it should have broken me. But instead, it opened the door to a truth I had buried for 30 years, a truth that turned the entire room against her. Have you ever stayed silent to protect someone you loved, only to be painted as the villain? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening. I hadn't seen Jeremy in 3 months, but I'd spent weeks choosing the right wrapping paper. I knew it was silly. 18-year-olds didn't care about wrapping, but I still combed through drawers until I found a roll of Sunday comics from years ago, the kind he used to giggle at when he was little. It felt like the smallest act of connection in a world that had grown strangely silent. The sky was a pale gray that afternoon, the kind of color that made you wish for a heavier coat or a warm drink. My beige dress clung gently to my frame, the hem brushing against my ankles as I stepped onto the porch of my son's house, a house I once considered mine in the emotional sense. The wood of the steps creaked beneath my sensible shoes, and a gust of wind carried the scent of grilled meat and trimmed hedges past me as I pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house, followed by a pause long enough to make my palms sweat. Then footsteps, sharp, clipped, and the door swung open. Francine stood there. "You're early," she said flatly, her smile as tight as a ribbon pulled too hard. Her eyes scanned me with all the warmth of a credit card machine. I glanced at my watch. "Only 15 minutes. I thought I could help set the table, maybe." She stepped aside. "Everything's under control," she replied, as though even my presence on the porch was something she hadn't budgeted for. I stepped in, my heels tapping softly against the polished hardwood floor. The smell of expensive candles, vanilla and sandalwood, I think, clung to the air. Balloons floated against the ceiling, tethered to delicate silver strings. Streamers in navy and gold twisted down the banister. A banner hung above the living room arch. "Happy 18th, Jeremy." The font was embossed. My arms tightened around the box I carried. It looked even smaller now, wrapped in faded comics. The corners softened from handling. I followed Francine's pointed finger to the gift table, a granite-topped console overflowing with glossy shopping bags and boxes adorned with velvet bows. I placed mine near the back, where it wouldn't disrupt the color scheme. From the kitchen, I heard laughter, sharp and unguarded. A burst of voices overlapped, clinking glasses punctuating the background. I stepped toward the sound instinctively, but Francine blocked the way with a plate of deviled eggs. "Feel free to wait in the living room. We're still prepping." I hesitated. "Anything I can do to help?" She tilted her head slightly, her earrings catching the light. "We've got it covered." I gave a small nod and turned, the hem of my dress brushing the floor as I walked to the couch. The living room had been redecorated since I'd last been invited. Clean lines, high ceilings, and not a photo in sight, except for one framed picture of Jeremy on a boat, squinting into the sun. He looked older than I remembered, more angular, more distant. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, folding my hands in my lap. My gaze drifted to a side table where a stack of magazines sat neatly aligned. Among them, a photograph peeked out. Jeremy as a toddler sitting on Richard's shoulders, both of them grinning ear to ear. I remembered that day. I'd taken that picture. It wasn't framed. The muffled sounds of celebration carried through the wall. Someone shouted, "Happy birthday!" followed by a burst of laughter. I smiled reflexively, though no one could see it. Then Helen's voice echoed in my mind. "One day they'll need the truth more than the comfort of their lie." She'd said it last month over tea, her hand resting lightly on mine. I hadn't believed her then. I wasn't sure I did now. "Olivia!" Francine called, suddenly appearing in the doorway with a glass of water. "Yes?" "Dinner's starting. We're seating everyone now." I followed her down the hallway toward the dining room, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary thick in the air. The room was softly lit, the table set with fine china and name cards tucked into miniature gold frames. Each setting had a folded napkin like a flower and a wine glass that sparkled under the chandelier. I scanned the table, searching for my place. It was there, at the far end, not beside Jeremy, not beside Richard, not even across from anyone I knew well, just there. Olivia. No mom, no grandma. As if I were someone's colleague or a last-minute guest added out of politeness. I slid into the chair, the cushion firmer than I remembered. Conversations bubbled around me, talk of colleges, new cars, promotions. I nodded at a few familiar faces, but no one engaged. The clang of utensils and the polite shuffle of chairs filled the spaces where words might have gone. Someone clinked a glass. "Let's raise a toast." Francine's voice rose smoothly over the table. "To Jeremy, our scholar, our athlete, our pride." Cheers erupted. Jeremy smiled, a flash of warmth, though it didn't quite reach me. I reached for my water and caught the trembling in my fingers. I steadied the glass with both hands. Had I truly become invisible in my own bloodline? I wondered, my throat tightening as the toast faded into chatter. From my end of the table, I watched them, my family, gathered around each other like planets orbiting a star that I used to be part of. No grandma, just Olivia, and that hurt more than I expected. The clink of forks faded as Francine stood, her wine glass raised just high enough to catch the chandelier's warm glow. I knew that tone. Light, performative, sugar-laced with something sharp underneath. She tapped her spoon to the rim twice, signaling the room into silence. "Before we begin," she said, smiling with hostess-perfect poise, "I'd like to take a moment to honor the people who helped shape Jeremy into the fine young man he is today." Chairs shifted. Murmured affirmations floated across the table like soft ripples. I reached for my water and steadied myself by touching the silver chain around my neck. My fingers brushed the locket, small, oval, discreet. Inside it was a photo of Richard as a baby, his chubby cheeks framed by a knitted blanket I'd made. I closed my eyes briefly and felt the comfort of that quiet memory, just long enough to brace myself. Francine began to move clockwise around the table, gesturing with one manicured hand. "This is Uncle Paul, who taught Jeremy to ride a bike. Patiently, I might add, after all those scraped knees." Polite laughter. "Aunt Sheila, who never missed a single one of his games, not even the away ones." Nods and proud smiles. "And Mr. Green, Jeremy's mentor during his internship. He's the reason Jeremy now dreams of corporate law." Another chorus of approval, the room leaning in with warmth and familiarity. She was building something. A wall, perhaps. Brick by brick, name by name. "And this," she said, pausing dramatically as her gaze landed on me. "This is Olivia." A longer pause. The air tightened. "The fiend who wrecked our family." It landed with the weight of a slap. There was a second, maybe two, of stunned silence. Then, unbelievably, a few people chuckled, unsure of the tone, trying to read the room. One woman pressed her lips together in awkward sympathy. A man to my left shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his napkin. Someone's fork slipped from their fingers and clattered against a plate. Richard didn't lift his eyes. He stared hard at his glass, jaw clenched. My cheeks burned, not with surprise, but with a familiar kind of ache, the kind you get when a wound is reopened in front of people who never saw the scar. Francine laughed lightly, the sound as brittle as spun sugar. "It's just a joke, of course. Olivia knows I'm only teasing." My name on her tongue felt like something sharp. I didn't speak, didn't flinch. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The stem trembled slightly between my fingers, but I held it steady. Jeremy didn't look at me. He stared at his plate, his smile from earlier gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. Embarrassment, confusion, or maybe guilt. I folded my napkin in my lap, one corner at a time, my fingers moving methodically. I could feel the heat in the room shift, not from the fireplace, but from the tension now pulsing through it. If they were expecting me to crumble, to protest, to plead my innocence like I had something to prove, I would give them nothing. Not now, not like this. I glanced around. The table had returned to its rhythm. Wine being poured, plates passed, cautious conversations restarting with a touch more restraint. But something inside me had tilted. Francine returned to her seat, laughing softly at something her sister whispered. She never glanced my way again, as if her little performance had been the end of my part in this story. I let the fork rest gently on my plate and reached for my handbag. It was an old habit. Feeling for the small box I'd tucked into the inner pocket that morning. My fingers found it, wood smooth under the fabric, carved edges familiar to my touch. The box was no bigger than a hardcover book, just heavy enough to make its presence known. I debated bringing it. Helen had told me I should. "If you're going to speak," she'd said, "let it be with truth, not tantrum. Show them what they made you carry." Back then, I thought I'd never open it. But now felt like the beginning of the end of my silence. I waited for the right moment, not dramatic, just deliberate. A lull between bites, a shift in the conversation, a small pause when even the room seemed unsure of its next breath. Then I rose. Not all the way, just enough to lean forward. I unzipped my bag, reached in slowly, and pulled out the box. The wood was warm against my palm. The family crest was carved into the lid, an old tradition from my husband's side. No one at the table had seen this box before, no one but Richard, and not for decades. I stood and crossed to the gift table. My footsteps echoed faintly, heels on tile, then back to the rug. I placed the box down carefully, right on top of the pile of glossy, overdone wrapping. It landed with a soft but decisive thud. Several heads turned. Jeremy looked up, his eyes flicking to the box, then to me. I met his gaze, held it. Let them open it. Let the story begin. Jeremy's fingers hovered over the old newspaper wrapping, and for a brief moment he smiled. "These are the comics," he said softly, turning the package over in his hands. "You always used these for my presents, even when everyone else used store-bought wrapping paper." The smile flickered across his face like a candle in a breeze, brief, nostalgic, and gone too quickly. He began unwrapping the gift, peeling back each fold slowly, almost reverently. The room around us was still. Conversations had dulled to murmurs. Chairs shifted. Glasses were held mid-air. No one was pretending not to watch anymore. The comics gave way to polished wood, deep brown with a slight red sheen. Carved into the lid was a name, our family's name, Gallagher. The design wasn't ornate, just deliberate. Strong lines, intentional hands. My late husband had sketched it one winter, saying every family deserved a mark to stand by. It had disappeared from our mantel years ago. Jeremy ran a thumb along the edge of the lid. "What is it?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not yet. I just nodded for him to go on. He opened the box. The hinges gave a soft creak as the lid lifted. Inside was a neatly arranged collection. Photographs, aged letters, a narrow envelope tucked beside a notebook with a cracked leather cover. At the top, resting gently against the velvet lining, was a black and white photograph. Jeremy picked it up. "It's Dad," he said, voice uncertain. "He looks young." Richard sat at our old kitchen table, his head in his hands. The shadows under his eyes were heavy, and his posture slumped. Scattered across the table in the picture were envelopes, some with final notice stamped in red. Jeremy frowned. "Was he in trouble?" I said gently. "Yes." I felt the weight of the moment pressing on me like a blanket too warm, but I didn't look away. "He came to me, Jeremy," I said. "He didn't know where else to go. I remember the sound of his voice that night, how it cracked when he said he'd failed, the business, the money, all of it." Jeremy's fingers paused at the next item. A letter folded so many times the edges had begun to fray. He opened it carefully. "It's to Helen?" he asked, glancing up. "She was a friend," I replied. "I wrote it after your father left that night. I never sent it. I just needed to put the pain somewhere." Francine's voice cut into the quiet like a knife. "Jeremy, we don't have to go through all of this right now. There are other gifts to open." He didn't even look at her. "No," he said, firm. "I want to understand." Next, he lifted a crisp document, clearly a bank record. He tilted it so he could read the header. "A transfer. $175,000? I nodded. "To your father, March 1993. Jeremy blinked. "You gave him that?" "I sold the house," I said. "Our family home, the one where your father grew up. It was the only thing of value I had left." He stared at me, lips parted, as if he was waiting for me to say it was a joke. "You sold your house?" he repeated. "Yes. But why?" "Because I was his mother, and he was drowning." Jeremy looked down again. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the leather-bound book. He opened to the first page. I knew what he would find. March 14th, 1993. Richard came over tonight. I barely recognized him. He looked 10 years older and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He asked if I could help. He didn't ask gently. He begged. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. I said yes because I love him more than anything I've ever owned. Jeremy kept reading, flipping through the pages. The soft rustle of old paper was the only sound in the room. Page after page, the years unfolded. Small entries, quiet sorrows, a record of sacrifice too long hidden. He didn't look up until he reached the bottom of the stack. "What happened to you afterward?" he asked. "I moved into a small apartment across town," I said. "I started over, quietly." "And no one knew?" "Not really." "Why not?" I paused. The silver locket at my neck brushed against my collarbone as I shifted. "Because I didn't want your father to feel ashamed. I thought if I stayed silent, he'd eventually remember. He'd come back. But silence has a way of hardening over time." Francine's eyes were sharp now. "This doesn't change anything." Jeremy turned to her, voice steady. "It changes everything." She bristled. Jeremy turned his attention back to the box. One last photo remained, our old house with a for sale sign planted in the front lawn. He looked up. "What house?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Your father's childhood home," I said. "The one I planned to die in." His jaw clenched. I saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. There were no more questions, just quiet, just the weight of decades settling gently around us. And in that silence, I wondered, did the truth lose its power after waiting 30 years? Or had it simply aged into something undeniable? Jeremy looked from me to the photo in his hand. "Is this you, Dad?" The question wasn't loud, but it landed like thunder. Richard didn't answer at first. His jaw tensed. His eyes remained fixed on the half-empty wine glass in front of him. The crystal caught the fading chandelier light, casting fractured reflections across the linen tablecloth. Jeremy stood up, holding the black and white photograph higher. "Dad?" Richard finally lifted his head. "Yes," he said, voice thin. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't look like a long time ago," Jeremy replied. "It looks like last week, like this just happened." I stayed quiet. The box still sat between us, a quiet witness to truths that had waited too long to breathe. The room had emptied slowly. A few guests lingered near the entryway, coats in hand, whispering goodbyes that no one replied to. The rest had already left, sensing something private had begun and not wanting to be present for its unraveling. Richard shifted in his chair, hands clasped together on the table like a man awaiting sentencing. "I was behind on some debts," he said. "Some?" Jeremy's voice rose just slightly. $175,000, final notices, loan defaults. "That's not some, Dad. That's ruin." Francine stood behind Richard's chair, stiff as a mannequin. Her eyes flicked to me, then to the box, then back to her husband. "It was complicated," Richard muttered. "Tell him," I said quietly. "Tell him what really happened, or I will." Jeremy looked between us, the photo still trembling in his hand. "You said you built everything on your own, that you got no help, that Grandma didn't believe in you. I thought silence would protect him," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "I was wrong." Richard exhaled sharply. "I made bad decisions, took loans from places I shouldn't have. I thought I could manage it. I couldn't." "What kind of places?" Jeremy asked, his voice sharpening. "The kind that don't send polite reminders," I said. "The kind that make threats." Richard flinched. "They weren't going to hurt me." "You didn't know that," I replied. "You were desperate." Francine stepped in, voice brittle. "That's ancient history. Why dredge it up now?" "Because I never knew any of it," Jeremy snapped. "Because you told me she was selfish, bitter, manipulative. You told me she never supported Dad, and now I'm reading evidence to the contrary." Francine's jaw clenched. Jeremy reached back into the box and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed newspaper. "And this?" he said. "Want to explain this?" He unfolded it slowly, carefully. The paper crackled with age. The headline screamed in bold print, "Local businessman narrowly escapes charges in investment scandal." Jeremy read the first few lines aloud. "Sources say the case collapsed due to administrative errors and lost documentation. Investigators were preparing to press charges related to fraudulent investment reporting." He stopped, looked at Richard. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. "Is this true?" Jeremy asked. Richard didn't answer. I leaned forward, the chain of my locket pressing cool against my skin. I clasped it, grounding myself. Then I spoke. "It wasn't just money I gave him," I said. "I got the charges buried." Jeremy blinked. "What?" "I called my brother," I said. "Your great-uncle William. He was a judge. Not in that jurisdiction, but he knew people. I begged him to help." Francine's mouth dropped open. "You what?" "William called in favors. Documents got misplaced. Evidence disappeared. A case without a paper trail is a case that dies quietly." "You mean you interfered with the law?" Jeremy's voice cracked. "I didn't know what else to do," I said. "Your father was spiraling, facing criminal charges. I couldn't watch him lose everything." "And then what?" Jeremy asked. "You covered it up, and then what?" "I moved out of the way," I said. "I let him rebuild. I thought he'd come back to me when he was ready." Richard finally spoke. His voice was hollow. "You risked everything for me, and I erased you." He wasn't looking at me. He was looking down, at the table, at the reflections in his wine glass, at the hands he had used to build a business, to hold his son, to sign the checks that once paid for Francine's real estate license, but not the ones that ever came back to me. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I let the weight of his words hang there. They were heavier than I could have imagined. The lights above flickered once, then steadied. Outside, a car started and pulled away. Someone had finally found the courage to leave the awkwardness behind. Inside, it was just us, 4 people at a table now too large for the truth to hide beneath. Richard turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed. "Why didn't you ever tell me how bad it got for you?" "I thought I was protecting you," I said, "from guilt, from shame, from the look you're wearing right now." He pressed his hands to his face, dragging his palms down his cheeks. "God." Francine stepped back. "You shouldn't have meddled. You didn't have the right—" "I had every right," I said, finally turning to face her directly. "I was his mother." Her lips parted, but no words came. Jeremy sat down slowly, the newspaper still in his hand. "You kept all of this hidden for 30 years. I nodded. "And you," he said, turning to Richard, "you let her. You let her be the villain in my life." Richard didn't deny it. The locket at my chest felt heavier now. No longer a comfort, a weight, a reminder of all I'd carried alone. The air in the room had grown dense, like we were sitting inside the eye of a storm too polite to scream. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. Can you forgive someone, I wondered silently, who only remembers you when the lies fall apart? I didn't come here to destroy your family, I said, my voice steady despite the tremble beneath it. I came to reclaim my place in it. The words fell into the silence like stones in still water. Ripples spread across the room, visible only in the way Jeremy's shoulders squared, the way Richard finally lifted his gaze to meet mine, and the way Francine's lips pressed into a pale, trembling line. The dining table looked like a battlefield, the carefully folded napkins now wrinkled and stained, glasses half full or forgotten, documents scattered like shrapnel. The memory box sat open, its contents spilling truth into corners that had once held only polite distance. Jeremy reached for the box, his fingers brushing the carved lid. He didn't say a word at first. Then he picked it up, walked the few steps toward me, and without ceremony pulled out the chair next to mine. The legs screeched softly across the hardwood floor. The moment he sat, the room shifted. The power in it. The balance of love and loyalty and memory. Francine's eyes followed him, wide and unbelieving. Jeremy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, the box between us. "Grandma," he said quietly, "why didn't you ever fight harder?" I blinked at the question, not because I hadn't expected it, but because I'd asked myself the same thing so many times. "Because I thought your father would come back when he was ready," I said. "I thought silence would make space for him to remember me on his own. I didn't want to scare him away. I was afraid if I pushed too hard, I'd lose what little I had left." Jeremy opened the locket at my neck, the one he'd helped me fasten earlier. Inside were the photos, baby Richard on one side, baby Jeremy on the other. "I never stopped believing in him," I added. "That was my flaw, or my hope." Francine scoffed, her voice cutting through the emotion like frost. "You're manipulating them." Jeremy turned to her slowly. "No," he said. "She's telling the truth, and I think we both know it." She shook her head, furious. "You're a child, Jeremy. You've known her for what? 10 minutes of honesty? You don't know the years she twisted things." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He pulled another sheet from the box, a printed bank statement stamped and dated. "She was saving for me," he said, laying the paper down for all to see. "In silence. For 18 years, while you were telling me she didn't care." Francine's hands curled into fists at her sides. Richard, who had been unnaturally quiet, reached for the statement and stared at the numbers. His jaw worked, his breath uneven. "You built this for him?" he asked me. I nodded. 10 years ago, I bought a small apartment. It was all I could afford with what I'd saved from part-time work after retirement. I rented it out. I never touched the income. I put it in a trust that would mature today, on Jeremy's 18th birthday. Richard looked at the balance. His face collapsed under the weight of it, not just the money, but the meaning, the years, the restraint, the love wrapped in restraint. "I want to match it," he said suddenly. "Double it if I can. It's time I act like a son." Francine stared at him. "You can't be serious." He stood, not hurried, not showy, just with purpose. Then he crossed the room and pulled out the chair on my other side. The wooden legs scraped the floor, a low dragging sound that made Francine flinch. He sat beside me, his mother, his first home. "If this is picking a side," Richard said, "then I pick the truth." The tension in the air didn't snap. It didn't explode. It simply shifted. Jeremy's hand found mine under the table. His palm was warm, mine was trembling, but my eyes were clear for the first time in decades. Across the table, Francine remained standing, arms folded. Her chest rose and fell with short, fast breaths. "So," she said, "after 30 years, I'm the outsider now." No one answered, not because we didn't hear her, but because the question wasn't really meant for us. It was for herself, for the walls she'd built that were now crumbling under their own weight. The candlelight flickered. The chandelier cast shadows that danced along the floor. I looked at my son and my grandson, on either side of me now, their presence filling in spaces I had mourned as permanently empty. The scrape of the chair, the brush of Jeremy's shoulder against mine, the paper-thin feel of Richard's apology carried in the gesture, not just the words. Francine's eyes were wet, but she blinked it away before anyone could comment. She turned and walked to the window facing the darkened yard. Behind her, the room breathed again. And in the quiet, I wondered, is love still love if it's rediscovered too late? "Mom," Richard said softly, clearing his throat, "would you stay? Just us for dinner." The question hung in the air, tentative but honest. He wasn't asking as a formality. He was asking like a son reaching for something he thought he'd lost for good. I looked at him, really looked, and I nodded. The house had emptied out hours ago. The echoes of a party that never was still clung to the corners, wrinkled streamers, abandoned forks, the faint scent of extinguished candles. But the kitchen was warm now, real, not staged. A pot on the stove bubbled gently, steam curling toward the ceiling. The air smelled of garlic, butter, and something new. Hope, maybe. Francine stood by the sink, silent. Then, slowly, she began setting the table again, not extravagantly, not for show. Just 4 plates, 4 forks. No smile, but no resistance either. It was enough. Jeremy opened the fridge and pulled out a bottle of wine. "We still have this," he said, holding it up. "Seems like a waste not to use it." Richard chuckled quietly, then set out glasses. The clink of glass on wood felt grounding somehow. Familiar. We sat down, not in the same seats as earlier, not in our assigned places. This time, we chose. Jeremy turned to me. "Tell me about Dad when he was my age," he said. "Before all this, before the business, before everything." I smiled gently. He was quiet, thoughtful, always tried to fix things, even when he didn't know how. Richard looked up, surprised. "I was." "You were," I confirmed. "And you had a bear, Mr. Beans, stuffed with dried pinto beans. You wouldn't sleep without him." Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Beans?" Richard covered his face, groaning. I laughed. He'd dragged that bear everywhere, lost him once at the grocery store, and wouldn't sleep for 2 days. Jeremy leaned back, grinning. "I don't remember any of that." "You weren't supposed to," I said softly. Francine looked across the table at me. Her voice was quiet. "I can't pretend we're fine." "Neither can I said honestly. "But I can try, if we try together." The words weren't elegant. They weren't dramatic. But they felt like an open door. No one reached across the table. No hands were clasped. But something shifted. Again. Jeremy poured the wine, slow and steady. The liquid swirled in each glass, catching the light. When he finished, he lifted his own. "To the truth," he said, "and to remembering who we are." We clinked glasses, softly, gently, and I felt something loosen in my chest. I reached for the locket around my neck. It had always been a weight. Tonight it was warm. Francine blinked quickly and looked away. Then, just as softly as the clink of glass, she said, "I can do civil." It wasn't peace, but it was the beginning of one. As we began eating, the kitchen filled with small sounds, cutlery tapping gently, low laughter, the quiet hum of a family trying to stitch itself back together. And I thought, not for the first time, maybe belonging isn't granted. Maybe it's reclaimed. As we passed dishes around the table and Jeremy laughed at a memory I thought was long forgotten, I felt something return. My place, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a mother and grandmother. No one has the right to make you invisible. Even after years of silence, speaking the truth can reopen doors you thought were locked forever. The bonds we rebuild may not look the same, but they can still hold. If you've ever felt forgotten by your own family, I hope you'll share your story. Let's remind each other that being seen, heard, and remembered is not too much to ask.